Buenos días a todos. Good morning, everyone. Let's start our last meeting, or apparently our last meeting, our sixth meeting. We have Nikolas Mittag. He's going to talk about administrative records and merging with household surveys, among other things. But before that, we are honored that President of INEGI, Julio Santaella, is here with us. So he's going to say a few words before we start.
Thank you, Raymundo. It's a pleasure seeing everybody. I see that we have a very large group of people for this last lecture of a series that was organized by a joint team between the OECD, Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico, and INEGI. I'm very happy to close very briefly the last lecture. The idea of these lectures has been to have a better understanding of different experiences around the world, to provide input for a group of experts that INEGI formed 1 year ago in Mexico. This group of experts is working towards improving the design and the operation of household surveys focused on income and well-being measurement. This expert group has been working very hard for the last year to close gaps between the current income expenditure survey in Mexico and the best practices that we have found all over the world. The expert group has the idea to propose some specific recommendations on different aspects, both from the statistical point of view, from the conceptual point of view, how to improve the operation, the validation, and to incorporate additional sources. So this series has been very useful in this respect. We have had distinguished lecturers from different institutions. We start with Marco Mira, that I see on the video from the OECD. He gave us a very brief overview of the well-being framework used in the OECD. The next session, we had Stefania Laminos and Emilio Di Meglio from Eurostat. They talked about the European Union SILC, the survey of income and living conditions, how that works in Europe, the European Union. Next lecture, we had Mark Turner and John Morris from our friends in Stats in New Zealand. This National Statistical Institute is definitely on the forefront of many developments, and it's not surprising that also in terms of income and well-being, they have a very interesting set of indicators. They have a Maori name that I'm not going to pretend to pronounce them, but definitely very good idea. Then we had Paul Smith from the Southampton Statistical Sciences Research Institute, and Paul gave us a lecture on improvements and innovations in survey design and the use that's going to help the statistical point of view of our surveys, and that's going to be very useful. The last session, previous to this one, was from Carlota Balestra from the OECD, and she gave us a very important insight about analyzing joint PDFs, or probability distribution functions, of income and wealth at the micro level, and how that could improve this measurement. Raymundo has already said, today we have Professor Nikolas Mittag from Charles University. I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, from the Czech Republic. Let me tell you that we have had participants from various continents and countries. Obviously, there's a very large group from Mexican institutions, but we had participants from other statistical institutes in Latin America, and of course, other research institutes across full continent. So with that, I will close and thank the participants and thank OECD and Ibero for their help. Thank you very much. Back to you, Raymundo.
Thank you very much, Julio. No, it's great. We're honored that you are here with us to close this series. We are very happy to have Nikolas. Nikolas, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Raymundo Campos. I am at El Colegio de México, but now on academic leave at the Central Bank. And well, it's a large group, the one that INEGI gathered, and we are interested in measuring much better income and wealth in Mexico. Well, after that, let me introduce Nikolas. Nikolas Mittag has been an associate professor with tenure since 2019 and an assistant professor as of September 2013 till 2019 at CERGE-EI under U.S. Permanent Charter. He also has been an associate professor with tenure on SERGE, Charles University since 2019. He has been working as a researcher at the Economics Institute at the Czech Academy of Science since September 2013. He received his BA degree in philosophy and economics from the University of Bayreuth and his PhD in public policy studies from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. We're very happy to have you, Nikolas. You have around 30 minutes. No problem if we go a few minutes past that. I'm going to turn off my microphone and my camera, but the floor is yours. Thanks a lot for accepting to present this study for us.
Perfect. No, thanks a lot for having me, and I'm of course honored to close such a series of distinguished survey researchers. And I hope, despite the format, I could add something useful to the survey. I have to admit it's the first time I give a talk completely online, so if anything goes wrong, anything doesn't work out, please just let me know. And in addition, I think the main point is to give you advice on questions you care about for the survey. So please feel free to interrupt me anytime if that's something you can do. I don't know how that works in an online setting. I know that works very well in a seminar setting. I'm very happy to answer any types of question. My understanding of the overall idea is that you're mainly interested in something that's methodologically similar to what I've done, which is what can we learn from the administrative data that we have now if we do survey design. I've mainly worked on a very specific part of it simply because that was the data we were able to link, which is poverty and welfare programs. But my understanding is that you're much more interested in a more comprehensive measure of income. So I'll talk about my research and what Bruce has done on it a bit, but if you have any questions related to that because you want to use it in a different context, I'm very, very happy to focus on that and talk about that. That being said, let me see if I can get to the idea of what I'll talk about. Even though it's just 30 minutes, I thought because I'll talk about three rather different things, if you don't mind. I have a short outline. I first wanted to just give you an overview of the projects I've been doing with linked administrative data, so that you can tell what you should trust me on or should not trust me on if I tell you. But I also wanted to mention some recent projects by Bruce Meyer, who was my supervisor and with whom I've worked on most of these issues, that I think go into the direction of where you're heading, which is a more comprehensive income measure. So I wanted to give you a brief overview of that, and then under second focus on a specific issue, which is using a specific paper, which is using administrative records to measure and decompose total survey error, because I think that's based on a very simple idea that we use that could potentially be useful in other contexts. And lastly, I just wanted to move to the discussion with some thoughts on measuring income and coverage of higher incomes, because I thought that's the main interest that you're interested in. Let me quickly check. Can you see the slides, or can you see them now? If you can't see them, please do let me know. They're probably important.
We cannot see them.
Yes, we cannot see them. Yes.
Okay, let me see if it.
They were okay 1 minute ago.
Okay, no, then now it's that now are we now back? Perfect,
yes.
Perfect. In the middle of talking, I was
we're
worried
back.
you see me and not the slides, but that was the wrong way around. So, perfect. No, if you have the slides now, then we should be all set to go. So let's go to the first part. Here's just a list of papers that we've used linked data into to in some way assess, improve, evaluate survey data. And let me point you to what I think are probably the more relevant ones. The first set is really just about measuring the extent and nature of survey error. That's something you can do with linked data. The concept is pretty obvious. You get a measure of truth either at the individual or at an aggregate level. The specific papers we've done there, I suppose, are more related to these government programs. So I'm not sure they're the most interesting parts. There's the idea that what I think you're probably more interested in is if you have a measure at the individual level, of course, an interesting thing is what do we get wrong in the aggregate, right? The very nature of a survey is to say we want aggregate numbers that are right. So the question is, how right do we get them? I think there's a substantive paper using linked survey and administrative data to better measure income. That focuses much on the left tail of the income distribution, on poverty, and it just shows what goes wrong. Again, the methods there are pretty simple, and it's a little US specific. So I wanted to talk about a more recent paper, which is the last one under 2, which is just an empirical total survey error decomposition using data combination, because I think that relies on a very powerful concept that says from these admin data you can get a measure of truth for aggregate statistics you get from the survey, and if you have that, you can use it to assess the survey error in very simple terms. So that's what I wanted to spend some time in slides talking about, because it might be something that you could most easily adapt to the context you do. And then the last part we've worked on is improving the actual survey data. And there, I think the main idea relates to if you cannot release the administrative data directly, or if you have it and you think it provides a better measure, but you cannot just publish it, or you cannot release the linked data because of confidentiality reasons, what can you do instead? I don't even know whether that's a problem that you have on your end or an option you have on your end. So I decided to not talk about that unless you ask me to. But I think there's the idea of the paper with Bruce Meyer and Michael Davern is a simple idea of how to impute it from the admin data, which would preserve confidentiality. There's some interesting projects going on at Census related to that. So if that's something you're interested in, I'm very happy to talk about it in the discussion or anytime later, but figured I'd focus on the more aggregate measure of how can we figure out what goes wrong in surveys, how can we use admin data to track the accuracy of surveys, and hence have the measures and tools to improve that. So as you can see, that's most of this work is on the left tail of the income distribution. That's one difference to what I think you're trying to study. The other one is that's on government programs in the US. So that might be a context that's very different from the one you're facing. So I wanted to first go over a couple of things that have happened since we did this work. I hope that it has contributed to the idea that administrative data can be helpful to improve survey quality. And ever since the US Census Bureau or the state agencies have been much more willing to share their data with researchers, and particularly with Bruce and his group of collaborators who are working on it, and they've extended the idea to study other parts of the income distribution, have more comprehensive income measures. I'll show you in a second why that wasn't the most useful thing with the data we had, because I'll show you what data they got. The obvious message there is that I think the same approach that we developed can be taken to measure other things. Some things have to be reasonably changed, but I think the key idea is the same. So what have they done in more recent projects, due to the availability of more programs, more data, more states, that has allowed them to extend the topics they study to study topics such as extreme poverty, which is extremely difficult to measure, because quite frankly, if you're living in extreme poverty, I'm not sure I want you to fill out a very long survey. I think I want you to get out of extreme poverty and not bother with the survey. So those are measures like $2 per day poverty. That was a big topic in the US. Homelessness, on which we have very few statistics because it's very difficult to survey them. That bears some somewhat ironic similarity to the other tail of the income distribution. Just much like someone in extreme poverty is difficult to find, is going to be very cautious about answering questions. It's going to be very difficult to get to answer the survey. The same applies to someone who's extremely rich. So I think that's much more of the idea that you want to do. So I think that's an interesting case study. What's more related to what I understand you want to do are the other 2 points, which are to examine the distributional effects of taxes and transfers. For that, you need the full income distribution, and to create what they call a comprehensive income data set, which is the challenging question. Could we just use administrative data to get a better measure of income? To what extent do we need linkage? Can we really recover the full income distribution from there? So I wanted to show you a couple of examples from Bruce's and others' recent work. It's not mine, so if I make any mistakes about it, these are mine. I'm just glad Bruce gave me those slides to use. One thing. The first thing that happens with that's the difference in that work, and that might be some more similar to what you have, is that now they have a wealth of data sources available. When I was still able, I wasn't able to travel to the US on a regular basis for a year or two, so I'm hoping to get back to this data. But when I last traveled, we had essentially this line off the table about SNAP, and it said, I think, 4 states over here. So of course, what we could do with that was limited and focused on poverty and on how can we do this, and to demonstrate that it's useful. Ever since they got a huge source of administrative data, starting from earnings records from Social Security and to many tax records, but also a lot of benefit payments from the government. I don't know how that is in Mexico. Having migrated to the US, what blew my mind is that you have a million of different government programs, and they don't seem to interact. They don't seem to mutually know what they're doing. So merging these data was a crucial step in the US. Whereas if I tell that to people in Europe, they say, "What do you mean? We have all these things in one place. So what's the big deal about that?" So you can obviously see that with these many sources of data, you could do a lot more things than we did. Most obviously, you can do what I think administrative data and data linkage is great for. You can do very simple things if you get it right. Namely, this table shows you just calculations that don't even require data linkage for different sources of income. So market income, taxes, that's not really income. Then cash transfers, in-kind transfers that I think are not as common elsewhere as in the US. What you can simply do is what Bruce did long before I joined him, which is to say, let me estimate the survey amount, that's column 1, then go to my administrative data source, compute the same numbers, and figure out, does the survey get it right on aggregate? Or does it capture too much? Does it capture too little? So you can see these are what we call net reporting rates, meaning that if they're higher than 1, it means that this is the inverse of the net reporting rate. If they're higher than 1, it means there's more of such income or more tax liability in the admin data than in the survey data. So that means the survey data doesn't fully capture that source. Whereas interestingly, here you have also a case where it overcaptures it. That's something very simple you can do if you have both data sources. It has a crucial requirement, or it has a caveat, that what if these populations are not comparable? What if the survey really is not intended to capture the homeless? What if it's not intended to capture people not living in residential units? That's a concern if you study poverty. The other concern about it, and that's the great advantage of linking data, is that you do not know why this happens. Right? This could be an issue that maybe your coverage adjustment is wrong. Maybe people underreport in the survey. Maybe some underreport and some overreport. Right? So for example, why do we see that market income seems to be better reported than transfers? Well, there's a big tendency to just underreport transfers, whereas we know that some people overreport income and some people underreport income. So in aggregate, those two are offsetting, and that makes the survey look better, leaving open the question, is the survey really better? For these kind of questions, you need to link the data, which Bruce and others are in the process of doing. So I would have really liked to have a graph that gets the main point of this one across better, but those were not yet cleared for disclosure. So what does this graph show you? This was the best one I could find that is close to a distributional analysis. What it shows you is if you took the survey income for granted on the x-axis, and you just wondered how much taxes do people pay in different segments, different deciles of the income distribution. What you'd of course like to see is, or why do you like to do that, is to see how progressive is the taxes and transfer system. That's relatively easy. In the Czech Republic, that would be mind-blowingly easy because we have a flat tax rate and we have 1 or 2 government programs, so you could just add that up. In the US, which is with its many sources of taxes, its many credits, its many transfer programs, it's not clear how they interact and how steep this gradient is. Now, truth be told, I think this graph doesn't tell you much about that. This graph tells you a lot about what's wrong with the income measure in the survey, because you can see one thing that's clearly not right from a substantive perspective, which is it's not progressive at all at the bottom of the income distribution. So you might wonder, why is that, right? Someone in the lowest 2 deciles of the income distribution, so that's poverty and right above in the US, they're paying more taxes than higher up in the distribution. And I think the answer relates to something you want to do, not so much to this one, which is that the income on the x-axis is misreported. One way to get this type of a pattern would be if there's something really wrong with the taxes and transfer system, right? It would tax people who are poor a lot, actually a lot more than the top decile, right? Another way you can get this is if people tend to misreport their earned income in the survey, because that means that people in the higher deciles of income, and we have a lot of evidence of that, sometimes just says, no, my income is 0. So we know that the CPS captures a lot of people who report 0 incomes, whose income is far from 0. Well, if that happens, you move a lot of people with high tax rates to these bins, and you get these types of statistics wrong. In addition, you can see that the progressivity of taxes is relatively flat for a system where at least the nominal tax rates are much steeper in the US. Again, this can happen if people misreport their market income, and I think this shows some evidence that people move towards poorer incomes. People underreport their income, and hence, right, they overstate their tax rates over here. So this is something that you could do, or you could analyze, or reason why you would want to analyze whether people accurately report some comprehensive measure of income. The graph I would have liked to show you is the one where they use administrative income on the x-axis and how it differs from this one. Unfortunately, that graph was not yet disclosed yet by the Census Bureau, so I don't have it. But I can tell you, no, at least fortunately, it doesn't look like this, right? We do not actually tax people in deep poverty at very high high tax rates. So these are some of the similar things I think you could do with a more comprehensive income measure if you put it together. The fact that it hasn't been disclosed yet underlines the idea that we're just in the process of putting that together. The things that have been cleared for disclosure concern more poverty. So if you have any questions of how I think that would work in higher deciles, that would work for any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. But let me tell you about this one project where we mainly focus on the government program that I think can be used in very, very similar ways to examine something like a more comprehensive income measure, coverage of rich income, of rich individuals or households, or basically any other measure for which you can get a measure of truth from the linked or unlinked administrative data. But if you have any questions about what I've shown you so far, please feel free to interrupt me and we can discuss that anytime. So what's this project about? This project ties into a concept called total survey error that I, as an economist, came about embarrassingly late in my life. Since you're working on surveys, you may be dealing with it much more. It's a simple idea of that maybe you should aggregate all errors, all sources of error, and figure out how accurate is the survey in total. And it's used, at least in the US, it's used a lot in the design stage of a process, which I understand that people are sitting around and thinking about how would something affect total survey error. Now that's great. It provides a structure, it provides a conceptual framework to conceptualize sources of total survey error if you decompose it. It provides a formal framework to think about it. But at least as Groves, who I think is credited as the inventor, confirms there, and that's my excuse for not knowing more about it, there are very few empirical studies of total survey error. And if you see them, they tend to focus on a very specific question. You manipulate something about the survey design and then analyze how does it affect total survey error. Does it make the survey more accurate? Does it make it less accurate? These are great questions. Understandably, if you do them for very specific details, that's very expensive, and you rarely get a measure of overall survey accuracy. You also won't be willing to do that every time. You won't be willing to every time. So what I know where people did this was when they wondered whether we should have the question on amounts on food stamps amount in the American Community Survey. They did a pilot project where they assessed, they figured it increases total survey error and it would be better to drop it from the survey. Now, naturally, that's a very specific question, and the study was never repeated. So we have no idea how it affects total survey in the long run. We have no idea how to monitor the survey over a longer period of time to see how many changes or many factors affect accuracy, how accuracy evolves over time. And I think the idea that we do in this paper is that if you have administrative data, if you can link it, then in many cases you can get a measure of truth for survey concept, where truth is in quotations because you can be strict about truth and say, well, that's slightly off truth. The key idea is that you have a much better measure of it that you could compare to the survey. The key advantage of that is that once you have that measure, there's a simple way to compare it. You could simply compare what does the survey give you to what's your measure of truth. There's something we call the survey target because we don't want to push the idea of truth too hard. The key thing about that is if this measure of truth comes from admin data or comes from some data that you can get on a regular basis, what you can do is continuously assess the accuracy of a survey at a more aggregate level. That allows you to monitor the survey accuracy over time, to monitor specific parts of it. And then if you see something worrying along the lines, you could still have room for these more detailed studies of seeing it. But essentially, it fills, in my view, a gap of a simple, reliable, cheap measure of what's going on, what's going wrong. And that could be extremely useful to, I think, you as survey producers are mainly interested in the idea of evaluating accuracy and cost effectively improving survey accuracy. I think another thing about surveys that you're probably more well aware of than I am is that we have lots of tools to improve surveys. The thing is they're incredibly costly. We can't do all of them. We have to somehow figure out what do we do, what's our best bet at improving overall survey accuracy. So here's the way that's where economics comes in, and you should say, well, you should improve where you get the most for your money, which raises the question, where is that, right? You know very well how costly these things are, but it would be very useful to have a framework that says, well, this is how much it likely improves things, and then also to have a framework to later on say, well, oh, in fact, it didn't improve it so much, or in fact, it improved it much more, which would give us a lot better idea on best practices in survey accuracy, as a complement to specific studies that zoom in on a very specific concept. I think on top of it, it can also be very useful to survey users to have these measures, just to have an idea of where is the survey accurate, right? If you go back to this question or this graph, you could argue that if you want to study higher incomes, right, that seems to be sort of fine. But if you want to study taxes or transfers in very low incomes, no, you don't want to use the CPS. The CPS has this specific problem of people reporting zeros, and maybe that's blissful ignorance, but it doesn't seem to be as bad in surveys like the ACS. So depending on your question, this would help you to find the survey or the survey questions that you can rely on and the limits of their reliability. So what do we actually do? Well, specifically, we focus on two government programs because that's what we had data on: SNAP or food stamps, and public assistance, which is by and large cash assistance. So that's cash you either get from the federal government or from state governments combined. It's actually a bunch of different programs that I can't tell apart myself, but it's all cash. It should be all cash that you get transferred from state or federal government. And we link these data to 3 different household surveys. The advantage of linking it to 3 surveys is that we can compare it and see how does it differ between surveys. The crucial step, I think, is not the crucial thing here is not what we study. You might want to study different amounts. You could decompose it into different components depending on what you care about, right? We look at average dollars received from these programs because that's what you care for from a government program, but you could of course care about all kinds of other statistics. What I think is crucial here is that under some circumstances, and that requires a lot of careful work, the admin data doesn't do that for you by yourself, is that you can adjust total dollars paid or any other statistic that you get from the admin data such that it matches the survey populations. If you can do that, then you have these measures of truth for the survey, or at least a more accurate measure. And from there on, everything is relatively simple because you simply compare something that you get from the admin data to something you get from the survey data. And the difference in these 2 things is your error. Now, that sounds surprisingly easy, and what's glossed over is that you actually have to match these. You won't get as accurate answers if you just take the entire data set, because there are differences in coverage, there are differences in what these concepts should study, and these questions loom much larger if you talk about earned income, where the definition of what you want to measure is less clear than in a government program, right? A government program really has two key advantages for linked data. One is it relies on payments made by the government, so in most cases those leave a paper trail of did money get sent out, right? So you can sort of assume that the government records are accurate. That's much more of a stretch for tax data, where I report my taxes, I'll claim to do it truthfully, though in the US that's hard because the tax system is so complicated. But you could assume, if you're mischievous, that people underreport their income on tax forms, right? That cannot really happen with government records on transfers. The other one is that it's a very clearly defined concept. Did you get money from this program, and how much did you get from it? That's a little more difficult with income. So that's a crucial step, to adjust them to be comparable, have the same concepts, the same population. Once that is done, you can compare all kinds of survey statistics to statistics from the linked data. So that's what I'll show you a bit about. We specifically care here about 3 relatively high-level components: generalized coverage error, item non-response, which is, does the survey cover the people? Do you correct for non-response correctly? Item non-response, if people don't answer a specific question. And then measurement error, do people misreport the amounts if they report it? I don't think the details are that important or specific to a program. With other income, you might do other things. So how do we measure them? It's relatively simple. Generalized coverage error is really just how much does the survey capture in total, and how much does the admin data capture in total. That tells you how much are you missing because people are omitted from the entire survey, right? If you took everyone in the survey, who would you be missing? So that just compares unlinked data. To assess things like item non-response error or measurement error, you need an accurate measure at the household or individual level. So for that, you need the linked data, which gives you this measure from the admin data. If you link the data to the survey, you have the survey reports for everyone, you have the admin amount for everyone, and you can simply compare them. So if you want to know how much are your imputations getting wrong, you could compute total imputed dollars. You can impute the administrative dollars received by the people who didn't respond to the question and compare the difference to see how well your imputations do on aggregate. Of course, you can do the same for reported dollars and see how well people do at reporting, and especially to see how much what the difference between those two is. You could further decompose things. I think in the interest of time, I won't get into the details of that unless you ask me to. Let me show you what you get. This is what I mentioned is the rather painful part about it, that doesn't really end up in the paper, which is to say I need to make sure that these populations are comparable, that they're right. And there are two key sources of getting things wrong. One is your administrative data might not cover the same population. Some people are usually excluded from surveys. So in our case, those were people who were homeless, people who lived in group quarters that the survey had no intention of covering. But of course, these people receive welfare payments, right? And they receive a lot of them. So we had to estimate those from different sources. In a similar way, at least it depends on how good the admin records and the surveys are. In many cases, linkage is imperfect. So if you miss some people by not linking them, you want to find out how many people, what amounts were you unable to link in order to have still a comparable set of records. So that's a crucial step. That's really case specific. It depends on the data you have. All I wanted to point out is that this is something you need to do because it amounts to about 10% of the survey amount in total, or even a bit more for public assistance. So if you attribute that to survey error, you would be giving the survey a very bad reputation because that's nothing at the fault of the survey. It combines things the survey didn't try to capture and things that we got wrong rather than the survey producers got wrong. Once we get rid of that, we have comparable measures and things become relatively simple as I discussed. Specifically, let me show you that for total survey error, where we just compute the survey target. That's from the last slide. And then we estimate average dollars reported by the households in New York. This is just about New York State because that's where we had the records from. And we can subtract them and see by how much the survey is wrong. And you can see that for government records or for government transfers, the differences can be enormous, right? The survey is off. The survey misses around 60% of cash assistance from that is paid to individuals in New York State. Of course, that vastly misrepresents these government programs. You can also see that it differs a lot between these two questions. For the CPS, right, it's much lower for SNAP than for public assistance. And then you have the odd case that the SIP seems to be doing relatively well. This is something people have conjectured for a long time. But this is not the end of the story, right? This is a very simple thing, wouldn't make for a full paper. What do we do next? We decompose total survey error into its sources. And this shows you that, well, the SIP does do very well, but not as well as these numbers suggest. And these numbers are not as similar as just this table suggests. What do we do next? We decompose this into the three sources of error that we say, does the survey cover the right population? What part are they missing? What's due to item non-response, which has received a lot of attention in the literature, and what's due to measurement error, meaning people underreport their transfer. Now, something that's specific to government transfers is that there, the first thing is these bars are by far the largest bars. Measurement error is by far the biggest problem with with government transfers. On the other hand, coverage seems to be relatively good. And item non-response error is in some cases not even visible in these things. That could be very different for other types of question, but here that's a common pattern we see. The other pattern we see is that total survey error is large, and it's even larger if you start decomposing it. So that goes back to the question, is the SIP really better than the other surveys? Well, you can see here that one thing the SIP does to be better is it also misses a lot of payments, but it makes up for them by overcovering the poor population. So you can argue that getting things right on average is still better than not getting them right on average, as the CPS does. But this shows is that net error understates the amount of total error. This bar is substantially closer to this one in size than the numbers on the previous slide suggest, right? Here you could think, oh, the SIP does really well, the CPS does really poorly. Well, that's because two errors offset each other. You could argue that's still better than not offsetting each other, but it would be even better to get things right. I think the other interesting takeaway point of this is that you cannot just assess total survey error for a survey as a whole, even for two questions that are very similar. Do you get program A? Do you get program B? What amount do you get? The same survey differs a lot in accuracy and even composition of total survey errors. So this really is a question-specific idea, and one advantage of having administrative records available to you is that you could do it for many questions, right? You couldn't possibly do a pilot study for every possible questions, but you could get a rough idea of which ones do we get wrong, and then dig deeper if you don't know what the issue is there. So these are just the key points that I think I summarized on the previous slides. And the main point I wanted to make is that this is a graph. Once we did go through the hard work of getting things comparable, you can imagine this is a graph that's very quickly done and computed. So it gives you a very easy and continuous thing to produce graphs like this, or if you come up with a better way of summarizing survey error on a regular basis and say, look, we're improving here. This seems to be a problem. What can we do about this? What's cost effective at addressing it? And I think you can do it for a lot of different things. You can do it for other statistics. You could do it for subpopulations if you have them available. You could do your own decomposition into other error components if you're specifically worried about imputation, if you're specifically worried about other points of editing, if you're worried about covering high incomes. You can easily define these components as long as you have a measure of truth from one data source and a measure of the survey of how well it captures that. You can easily do the same as we did here. Unless you have any questions on that, I think I've been already used up 30 minutes, so I just wanted to go over to the discussion, which I think is the interesting part, hopefully, of this. And I came up with, based on the suggestion that you do care about measuring income rather than income from government transfers, and specifically the crucial issue of capturing high incomes. I wanted to start with a couple of quick and somewhat obvious thoughts on how are things different if you want to move from government programs to income. So one thing that I think is very much possible and much worth the effort, but substantially harder for income than for something verifiable like income from the government, is to look at a comprehensive income measure. Why is that? Well, for government transfers, you can use a similar approach as long as you think the government records are reliable. Wage income is still a middle of the road thing, because in many cases employees are required to report wage income and have incentives to report it accurately, right? You can get it from Social Security records or from firm records who have no incentive to underreport it. But the moment you have a lot of informal employment or employment not covered by Social Security, that's much more difficult, right? For these sources of income, it's much more difficult to get some external estimate of how high they are, how reliable they are, and it gets even more difficult for non-wage income. income from self-employment, other sources of income. The good thing, and that's what Bruce and others are trying at the moment, is you could get it from tax forms. As I mentioned, it's not clear, do you have an accurate measure, or do you now have multiple measures with error and can work with that? And there's an issue of timing. While in many cases these are required to be reported with a date, non-wage income, such as realized gains from trading, they're often reported on tax forms when they're realized, not when they're achieved. So my view is that measuring income is challenging. So that's sort of what we should do, right? It's what we need to measure. One thing that I think is difficult to be aware of, or comes from my experience working with these records, is that there's a huge advantage if you have survey questions that are similar to what's recorded in the admin data. In the US surveys, there are basically no questions about that correspond to the fields on a tax form. So all we can do is add up all sources of income from admin data, all sources of income from the survey data, and say, are we getting it right? It would be very beneficial if we had similar ideas in the survey as in the admin data. Say you ask about income from formal payments, from informal payments, about non-wage income, wage income. Then you can match specific fields in your admin records, and you have a much easier time validating it with administrative data. Now that's the part that I think is challenging. I think the part that's substantially easier, and that's an upshot of the paper I told you about, is something we know very little about, and you can see it unfold with the 2020 census these days, is, are we covering the population right? Are we getting that right? Are we missing people? Are we overcovering some people? I think we know much less about that than about item non-response and measurement error, even though that's easier to assess. Why is that? Well, one reason is that you don't need to link the data for that. For that, you can compare aggregates from both sides. The other one is that you do not rely anymore on the amount actually being right. If you could, in your records, identify people who, say, belong to the right tail of the income distribution, based on large asset income, based on large asset holdings, based on firm ownership, based on large consumption, you can assess what fraction of them you're covering, even if you don't think that they report their income correctly in the admin data, simply because you know how many people are in each bin of the income distribution or fall into that category, and how many people fall into that category according to the survey. I think especially if you're able to link many many administrative data sources, you can make a lot of progress on identifying what's the number of high income people, what's the number of middle class people, what's the number of firm owners that you have in the data. And then the moment you have that, you can examine whether you cover the right populations even without linking the data sources. Of course, there's still a benefit from linking the data, at least the guy who links data tells you, or is happy to tell you, because then you can assess, why are you missing them? Who's missing? What's missing? Is it the adjustment for the weights? Is it the sampling frame? Is it something else? But even if you can't link it and you don't have an accurate measure, I think this is something where you can make a lot of progress on a topic that I was told you're interested in. So that was all I prepared for today. I hope it was useful, and I'm very happy to answer any type of questions you have about it.
It's great, Nikolas. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. So in the meantime, while I am getting the questions, let me ask you three things. So the first is, maybe if you can tell us a little bit about the linking sources in Europe or in the US between household surveys and administrative data. In Mexico, this is not as common as in those countries. So if you can tell us a little bit about your experience, or about what you know of how to do this, or what challenges the government or researchers face. The second question is about imputation. You talk a little bit about that. And so when, in which cases can imputation be a good alternative? My impression is that from the examples that you mentioned and from in my own research, is that imputation helps you a little bit, but there is still a lot of error going on. So imputation is not enough. But then this is related to the third common question, is that, so what else would you put, or do we need in the survey to impute much better, or to have aggregate information, at least to compare with administrative data? So these are my three questions, comments, and then you have time to answer them, and then I'll ask questions from the audience.
Perfect. These are very good questions. Let me see whether I can get myself back on the screen rather than the slides. So these are good questions, and they all have long answers. So let me try not to bother you with long answers. I'm very happy to follow up on it. First, to linkage. My experience. So I haven't actually linked data in Europe. I've just talked to the people who do. And my experience is that it's very different. It depends on both what data is available and what's the legal framework, and they work in different ways. So in the US, and the moment I leave this office, I'll think that should change. But while I'm working on linked data, I'll happily take it. We're pretty much free to link your data to admin sources, unless you explicitly tell us not to. So that means that we don't have much of an issue with non-consent to linkage. And ever since the linkage algorithms got better to go through large databases, we're able to link a huge share of respondents. I think in the data I've shown you, we're able to link around 90% of households to the admin data. That reduces a lot of problems that you get in Europe, where you need to explicitly ask for consent, and then people very often say no rather than yes. So if you have a way to do it as an opt-in measure, opt-out measure, that's much better. That solves a big problem that we have in Europe, I think, that we don't have in the US so far. The other advantage, or the other difference that goes the exact opposite way, is the question of linkage error, right? I've sort of claimed we made no linkage error. I think that's clearly not true. Some of these are mislinked. What we do in the US is we use probabilistic linkage, which essentially means that you have a number of variables that hopefully uniquely identify a person in each data source. And then we say, look, let's compare these. If all of them match, all is good. If few of them match, we convert that into a propensity that you match. And then we pick a cutoff where we say, or census picks a cutoff where we say, look, this matches, this doesn't match. That's based on Filigi and Sunter, old work that was much improved by Winkler and others at the Census Bureau. There's some papers on how exactly it works. Obviously, that has, compared to Europe, where essentially you have a unique government ID. And if you get ID, you link the person to the right person. That's much less reliable, and it's much more difficult to evaluate how reliable it is, right? I can only claim that we did a good job and that it worked out. I really hope someone evaluates that at some point and figures out how we mislinked people. A big advantage, on the other hand, we have in the US or at census that's related to Europe is if you have these unique IDs and a population register, you link records one by one. You take the admin data, link it to the survey. What they do in the US, simply because they don't have a population register, is they link both data sources to essentially a register of all social security numbers that the Census Bureau has compiled. I really hope they did a very good job with that, because that's crucial. But if they did, the big advantage is that we know in both data sources who wasn't able to be linked. In most cases in the admin data, you do not know whether someone was not linked, or in both sources, you do not know whether someone was not linked because they are not in the other data, they didn't receive government programs, they didn't pay taxes, or because you couldn't find a match and they are in the data. We can distinguish those two cases if you link both to a central list of possible identities. And that's crucial for the adjustments we made there. I think those are the two key things that I have. So let me quickly jump to the third question because that relates to it. Obviously, depending on one advantage of survey questions would be to make the linkage better, right? If you have a set of questions that really uniquely identifies people and that's likely to exist in the admin data, then it's really valuable to ask those questions and to make sure they're right. That's mainly an issue with the admin data. You could think that, for example, why don't we use, say, gender to link these records? Well, the government records, the government programs don't care about your gender, right? Because you get the program irrespective of your gender. So do they record it accurately? You'd hope so, but no. The number of kids who change their gender every year in the food stamp data is mind-blowing, which means probably they say, well, why am I supposed to record that? Let me put any type of gender. So they're figuring out which variables are accurate in both data sources, and can we link on those? That seems something that if we were able to influence the design would be valuable. Similarly, if you know what data you have accurate information on in the admin data, asking income questions that are somewhat relatable to those questions is of huge value, because then you know what's being underreported or where does linkage work and where does it not work. And my take there would be particularly, suppose you can verify income from the formal sector. Then you really want me to report whether my income was formally within that data source or not, because then you can validate a large share of the income. Whereas if I don't tell you, then I can't do either, right? Because I don't know which of the two is wrong. Lastly, the question of imputation is one that I worked on for a bit during graduate studies, and in the past years I've realized that people like John Rothbaum at the Census Bureau are just doing very good work on it. I think this is something that will really change. We did imputations based on survey information, and I think that has a problem. In the best case, it does little to aggregates, and in the worst case, it introduces a lot of error at the individual level. What we find here is that that's both the good and the bad part are true. The Census Bureau does a very good job of getting aggregates right with the imputation. At the individual level, there's a lot of error. As someone who runs things like probit models, that gets me very worried about imputations. I think the trick to that is, or the key statement here is that imputations are really, the real value from them would come if you incorporated information that's not elsewhere in the survey. If it only comes from the survey, then the conditional at random assumption remains untestable. You can make it and it solves the problem, if it solves it. The moment you might have administrative records, you could include information in the imputation that are not included. Just whatever imputation model you use, you could include the admin variable or anything from the admin data. And I think that really adds value to it, because these are variables you probably can't give to the public, but now they can use them or they can benefit from them. And the second one is that now the imputations are sort of no longer borderline redundant, right? I think the US surveys do, if I may say, a spectacularly poor job of using a model to do it, because they have to be historically consistent. I think more recent things are probably much better, but I know John Rothbaum is really working on a lot of these things, and if you have specific questions about that, I'd be very happy to ask him or forward things to that. A separate question here that I've done is, what if you can't release the survey, the admin variable? Then what about imputing the entire variable? I think that's often a viable strategy. It's much better than keeping it in secret, as we unfortunately do. So that could also be an option. I'd be very happy to talk more about. Did that answer?
Yes, no,
partly?
perfect. Yes, thank you. We have a lot of questions. So I think that the methodology questions are more or less answered. So let me start. So we have questions on what is your experience on if there are any cases that you know combining household surveys with administrative data for the upper part, the highest, for the highest income. In Mexico, what INEGI attempted to do with merging the tax records with the household surveys to see how inequality has changed. But I don't know if you can say, think about that. And then Graciela Teruel has a couple of questions on if you want to calculate the total survey error and it is a multidimensional survey, do you use different sources for the different dimensions? And so that's another question. And I would like to merge that question with a follow-up of Chele Teruel. That, I mean, if you know the error, do you know how to reduce that error within the household survey? So once you know the error, are there ways to decrease it within household survey, not with linking administrative data? And finally, a question from Paloma Merodio is, do you know any use of machine learning to analyze administrative data? I imagine that the question is how to use machine learning to probably merge much better the administrative data with the household survey, or in this area. Okay, so now let's take 5-8 minutes for those questions, and then I'll ask you other questions.
Perfect. Yeah. Let me. If I forget any of the questions, please remind me to answer them. But let me go through them one by one. In terms of research on the upper part of the income distribution, I don't have a full overview of what's going on, so I can give you the ones I know. I know that Richard Burkhauser at Cornell and co-authors have worked with for a while, worked with tax records to examine income from assets, from dividends at the upper tail of the income distribution, and have looked at the effects of top coding using administrative records on high incomes. I asked Bruce about this. What's the status? What are you? Because now they have the tax records, and they said, and he essentially said, you know, the further you move to the right of the income distribution, the harder things get, and we're about in the middle. So they're getting there. I hope that they'll provide things soon, but I think that's the most challenging part of it. Now that's the US, where I think high incomes are particularly difficult to capture because there are not that many high wage incomes. I wonder whether so the German IAB did a lot of work on linking data to examine their surveys. They might have done something. The places that would be easily able to do it would be Scandinavia, where a lot of high incomes are in the admin records, but I'm not aware of any research they did on it. So if I were to look for them, I'd look at Burkhauser's work and see what other things he cites. But that's the short overview I have. So that was the first question. And the second set of questions related to how would you measure total survey error in multidimensional surveys. And I think the important answer is that what we do is really specific to one question. You could do it question by question. And for each question, so you can see in our slides, we had one set of data from public assistance, one set from SNAP records. So we essentially use different data sources to assess different questions from the survey. And I think that's only fair to point out that examining one question doesn't get you an overall measure of how good is the survey, right? Each question of the survey has error that can differ from different sources. So this is very much an idea you could do question by question, which again underlies the idea that it's perfectly understandable that people didn't do pilot studies for every single question to get the total survey error, because that's expensive and a lot of work. Whereas the advantage of linked data is that it's maybe not as accurate, it's maybe not as variable as doing an actual study, but it would allow you to do it on a large scale basis, right? You could pick all the income questions that you could match in admin data and just do it every year again. So that would also give you, in my view, a much better idea. So I think that was the next question. How can you use this to actually improve it, right? This is sort of the bad part about me presenting everywhere. I come somewhere and tell them about problems, right? Where are the solutions? Where are the improvements? I think a big advantage of doing it repeatedly is that we get a better idea of what actually works. In some cases, such as with imputations, I think there's a huge body of research on what should be done, what could be done. With measurement error, I think, quite frankly, there's much less. One thing we find from the food stamp data, for example, just to provide you an example of how it could go about if you do it repeatedly, is that there's a lot of going in. You think people don't report government receipt because of stigma, because they're embarrassed to tell. That doesn't look like it at all. It looks like that plays a role, but the really key thing about this seems to be recall. People answer as if they're asked about today when they're asked about the past year. So that amounts for a lot of this issue that we don't capture government transfers in the middle of the distribution. If you received it like back a year, it wasn't a nice experience, you'd rather not talk about it. So I don't know, is it a good recommendation to say, well, you should shorten the recall period on these questions where you lose information as well, right? But that's something you could see with this type of validation measure. And you could do interesting things, such as, well, maybe what if we asked some people for 6 months and some people for 12 months, and then later on we figure out who gets it more. Did that really improve things to offset the loss of information? So my take is that from the linked data itself, you can get a lot of conjectures of what's going on. You can make a lot of educated guesses. I think if you're at a survey agency, that helps you a lot, but they're educated. Yes. Okay, yeah. Perfect.
Nikolas,
okay. Yeah. There was a brief technical problem that I hope they solved. Am I back?
Okay, yes, you are back.
Yeah. So I think the bottom line is that I think by getting repeated measures of how things change, how they get better or worse, this can give you a very good idea of what improves the survey. If you do it for a specific case, you and I probably have a lot of reasonable conjectures that as a practitioner, I think I'd implement. As an academic, you're supposed to be much more constrained until you have the truth, right? So at that level, I think it takes a much longer time. So I think learning this could come from repeatedly doing it. Then I think the last question was on machine learning. I don't know anything about machine learning methods to better merge the data. My impression from the linkage algorithm the Census Bureau used is that we'd probably call that a machine learning algorithm if we came up with it 20 years later. Because what it tries is it tries to predict something and not bother so much with its theoretical properties. So that captures both the extremely useful part about machine learning and the downside in academia, right? And I think it's very reasonable to do that. What I know goes back to your question on imputation. And there, I think machine learning tools can be very useful, because there you care about predicting a value at the individual level. That's rarely something we do in academic research, which is why we're reluctant with machine learning methods. But if you do that at the individual, if that's what you want to do, then that seems much better, right? It's a tool that's made for these things, and not like the hot deck, which is actually not, right? Or many other imputation algorithms. I think, again, that's what John Rothbaum has been playing around with. I wonder whether his working papers on that are available. I'd be happy to look them up and send them. So that's one point that I happen to know, because it happens at Census Bureau. But there, it's a very valuable tool, I think. There you want to take all the information you have and combine it into one prediction. And that's exactly what machine learning methods do. So that strikes me as a very useful thing to do. Did I miss any questions?
No, you're right. So let me ask you, it's the last round, because we're out of time, but I think the questions are very important. One, we have several questions on what happens, related questions, and you mentioned this in your presentation. One is that, I mean, what happens when the administrative data is not right? I mean, we have to assume that the administrative data is the correct one, is the correct distribution. And this is related to several questions on, I mean, if in Mexico you have the informal economy, as you said, half of the working force. So how, I mean, if the linking will be useful in such cases. And then Alfonso has question too. I mean, can you solve this, or have you thought about trying to account for the errors using an experimental design, or trying to solve for these questions using an experimental design? And those are the questions.
Yeah, no, those are very good questions, and to be honest, they're so good questions that that's sort of where I drew the line of my research. This is where I've gone so far. Then it gets substantially harder. But that doesn't mean it's less useful, right? Our research was very much based on this idea we have a reasonable measure of truth. Right now, it's very clear that holds in some cases, and now that we move to more comprehensive income, we get to exactly what you say. Others have done very good work on it. I forget who they are, but there are a couple of papers that say, what if you have multiple error-prone measures? I think that's very useful in one case. Those papers all rely on the idea that the error in the two data sources is independent, meaning that you don't have systematic bias in one and systematic in the other one. I didn't go there because that's clearly not true in the tax record case, right? There you have the clear idea that maybe some people over-report in the survey data. Those might be illegal incomes, those might be informal incomes, and you clearly under-report strategically in the admin data. I think people at Census are working on it now. So what I think what the bottom line of these papers is that if you can have a model of the error, and by model I mean something very simple, such as if I knew that someone is working in the informal economy, I can very much predict that the income they report in the tax form or whatever is likely not going to be accurate, but maybe the survey income is much better. Right? So if I can come up with that, I think I can go a long way of combining them to get something I wouldn't call truth, but a much better measure of it. So one way to go would be to come up with a model that says now we're accurate. The other way would be to say to do something simple along the lines of what Bruce and others did for poverty. They looked at information in the survey and tried to predict whether your zero income reported is actually reasonable. If you reported owning your house, owning a car, and you reported self-employment income in the last quarter, most likely you didn't have zero income in this year, right? So that way you could petition the survey, and there's scope for asking survey questions that allow you to do that, and then say for these guys we very likely have an accurate admin measure, and we do it. For these guys we need to get it from somewhere else, and for these guys it's hopeless, right? One story I like to tell over and over again, in it's people who did these surveys at the Census Bureau said it's mind-blowing to what extent people report income from drug sales. Now, those are never going to show up in any admin data, I hope. Maybe in case of the opioid data now, but those never show up. So there's some merits to survey questions, right, that you would never capture elsewhere. And I think figuring out how to combine these sources of income and then predict a very good measure, that would be really a crucial step we do. I think there's some progress. I think that's essentially case specific. There's a setup right now. I think, do you work in the, is that income from formal employment or not, is a reasonable survey question that people might answer truthfully, especially if they're not reluctant to report income from drug sales. So that's a way you could prepare the survey to do that, and maybe even use, again, machine learning to cluster people. Should they match the admin data? Should they not match the admin data? That would also give us scope to evaluate the admin data, right? All we can do in our case is to do reasonable things like, do we find people in other states in the survey? A lot of them. That shouldn't happen, right? So we know, and it doesn't happen much, so we know that that seems reasonable. But there to essentially get at errors from linkage, errors in the admin data, those are very interesting concepts for research, and I hope that Census Bureau does a lot of that now. So I think the bottom line of it is that I had an easy talk because of this assumption that it is close to truth. That doesn't mean it should stop there, right? There are a lot of things you could do, especially if you have multiple sources of admin data that could be used to improve them, and especially if you're able to adjust the survey such that you could verify different things. You could evaluate how well they're matched. There were some more detailed questions, I thought.
Yes, the last is how, I mean, do you think you can solve for this in an experimental design on the types of questions to try to measure income? Has anyone thought about that?
I think that's a good question. I wonder whether people at Census who work in the survey design have thought about that, because again, we just show problems. You could very much do the reverse of what we do, right? To say, if I really study people, if I really get the measure of truth from them, can I evaluate the admin data with that, or the linked data? I think that would be incredibly valuable to do. It again hinges on the concept of getting some measure of truth. So for that, my take would be that's very useful, but it's easy to be too ambitious about it. I think getting a true measure of income is very difficult, but maybe getting an idea of the size of the informal sector, or average incomes in the informal sector, or income from a specific source that you can match, that could work. And I think it would be more helpful than our work suggests, because in many cases you look at these results and you look at who doesn't report, who gets it wrong, and it gives you a reasonably clear idea of what's going on. If you are actually producing the survey, then you can start playing around with the survey, introducing reasonable changes where things are off, and you could see whether they improve things. That's something that's not open to us. We can just say this is right or this is wrong because we didn't get to play with the survey. But I think that would be a way to make progress. But I think it hinges on the question of, in your experiment, can you identify some measure of truth that's related to what you really care about? And that way you could check what are you missing from the admin data? What are you missing from the survey? I think that's a very good idea. It's an interesting question. When I'm back at Census, I should check whether anyone's taking us up on it. If there are any questions related to the details of the linkage or what do we do to assess its accuracy, to correct for it, I'd be very happy to answer them by email later on. These are technical questions, so I'd give a bad, boring answer to them now.
No, that is great, Nikolas. Thank you very much. Yes, so we're out of time and we have lots of questions, but if you allow us, we will send you the questions by email, and then we can send the response to everyone in the group. Yes, thank you very much for the great presentation. It helps a lot for the work we are doing. And so thank you everyone for being here and listening to the presentation and for your questions. And I think we are out of time, so we're perfect. Thank you very much to everyone.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for having me and for all the good questions. I look forward to getting the other ones by email. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. It's very easy to come to Mexico City these days. It looks like.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes. Bye.
Bye.
Gracias, Ricardo.